The words left her mouth as a desperate gamble, nothing more. Vessa Thornwood had no idea that the stranger pressing her against the moonlit garden wall, his hand warm against her waist and his breath close enough to feel on her lips, was the one man in the entire kingdom who never pretended anything. She'd gotten herself into this situation exactly the way she got into every terrible situation, by running her mouth before her mind caught up. The autumn gala at Lord Fenwick's estate was supposed to be simple. Slip in through the servants' entrance, steal the land deed her dead father had been swindled out of, slip back out before anyone noticed. She'd spent 3 weeks planning it. 3 weeks sewing a gown from salvaged silk. 3 weeks memorizing the layout of the manor from a stolen blueprint. 3 weeks telling herself that a girl who'd survived alone since 15 could survive one night among wolves in fine clothing. What she had not planned for was Dorian Ashmore. Her former betrothed stood near the fountain, his pale eyes scanning the crowd with the possessive sweep of a man who considered everyone in the room either a possession or an obstacle. He looked exactly the same as he had 2 years ago when she'd fled their arranged engagement in the dead of night. The same cruel mouth, the same manicured hands that had bruised her wrist the one and only time she'd told him no. And he was walking toward her. Her stomach dropped. She turned sharply, champagne sloshing in her glass, and nearly collided with a wall of black velvet and warmth. The stranger caught her elbow before she stumbled, his grip firm but not painful, and when she looked up, her breath simply stopped. He was tall in the way mountains were tall, the kind of height that rearranged gravity. Dark hair pushed back from a face carved with clean, hard lines, a jaw that could have been cut from granite, and eyes the color of winter amber. Gold shot through with something dark and wild. He wore all black, no house crest, no sigil, nothing to identify who he was. Just a man built like a weapon wrapped in expensive fabric. Those amber eyes dropped to her face, and something in them shifted. A flicker. A stillness. Like a predator catching a scent it hadn't expected. "Careful," he said, and his voice was low and rough, the kind of voice that vibrated through floorboards. Vessa's pulse kicked. She glanced over her shoulder. Dorian was 15 feet away now, his eyes locked on her, recognition dawning across his features like a slow, terrible sunrise. She turned back to the stranger. "I need you to do something for me," she whispered, and she hated the tremor in her voice, hated the desperation clawing up her throat. "Please, just pretend you love me." Before we continue, please take 2 seconds to like this video. It tells me you want more stories like this. The stranger's gaze moved past her shoulder, reading the situation with an intelligence that had nothing to do with books. His eyes found Dorian, assessed, and returned to her. Something in his expression hardened, then softened, then became something she couldn't name at all. "Say it again," he murmured. She blinked. "What?" He stepped closer. Close enough that she could smell cedar and wood smoke, and something underneath both that made her blood hum in a way she did not understand. His hand came up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The brush of his fingertips against her temple sent a shiver racing down her spine. "Ask me again," he said quietly. "I want to remember the first time." Her lips parted. Her mind scrambled to make sense of his words and failed, but Dorian's footsteps were getting closer, and her body was choosing survival over logic. "Pretend you love me," she breathed. "Just for tonight." The stranger's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. It was softer than that. More dangerous. "Forever," he said. And then he kissed her. Not the way a stranger kisses someone. Not hesitant. Not performative, not the careful press of an actor hitting a mark. He kissed her like he was answering a question she hadn't known she'd asked, one hand sliding into her hair and the other settling against the small of her back, drawing her into the warmth of his body with a gentleness that undid something in her chest she'd spent years wiring shut. Her hands found his lapels. She held on. The world narrowed to the taste of him. Dark and sweet. and the way his thumb traced slow circles against her spine, and the low sound he made against her mouth. Something between a groan and a confession. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, and his breathing was uneven, and those amber eyes were no longer still. They burned. "Is he gone?" she whispered. He stopped walking. His voice was rougher than before. "He's watching." "Good. That's good." She tried to step back. His hand stayed on her waist, not gripping, just there. "Thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Aldrich," he said. "What?" "My name. Aldrich. Since you asked me to love you, I thought you should know it." Something about the way he said it, plainly, without pretense, like he was handing her something real, it made her chest ache. She swallowed hard. "Vesa," she said. "And I asked you to pretend." His eyes held hers, that not quite smile again. "Of course." He offered his arm. She took it, because what else was she supposed to do? And together they walked deeper into the gala, and for the next hour Aldrich played the part of a man in love so convincingly that she almost forgot it was a lie. He kept his hand on the small of her back as they moved through the crowd. He leaned close when she spoke, as if her words were the only sound in the room worth hearing. He laughed at something she said about the terrible champagne, a real laugh, warm and startled, and the sound of it did something to her stomach she chose to ignore. When Dorian approached their table, Aldrich's arm came around her shoulders, and he looked at her former betrothed with a quiet, devastating calm that made the other man's smile curdle like milk in the sun. "I don't believe we've met," Dorian said tightly, his pale eyes flicking between them. "And you are?" "With her," Aldrich replied. Simply, finally, like it was the only identification that mattered. Dorian's jaw flexed. He looked at Vesa with something that might have been rage wearing the mask of concern. "Vesa, darling, I've been looking for you. Your family was so worried when you disappeared." "I don't have a family," Vesa said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "You made sure of that." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Aldrich's thumb moved against her shoulder in a slow, grounding stroke, and she leaned into him without thinking. Dorian opened his mouth, but Aldrich spoke first, and though his voice was soft, it carried the kind of authority that didn't need volume. "She's told you she has no interest in continuing this conversation. I'd suggest you honor that." Something passed across Dorian's face, something that recalculated, and he smiled the way snakes smile, all surface, and excused himself with a bow that fooled no one. "He's going to be a problem," Vesa murmured when he was gone. "I know," Aldrich said. His hand was still on her shoulder. His warmth was everywhere. She looked up at him. "You don't even know what kind of problem." "Tell me." And because she was exhausted, and because his voice was gentle, and because pretending felt safer than admitting she was terrified, she did. She told him about the land deed, about her father's death, about Dorian's family buying her father's debts and using them to force the engagement, about the night she'd run with nothing but the clothes on her back. She told him about 2 years of surviving on odd jobs and stolen meals, and sleeping in barns when winter got too cold for the forest. She told him everything, and she didn't know why. Aldrich listened without interrupting. His face didn't change, but his eyes did. They grew darker, not with pity, but with something sharper. Something that looked like the edge of a blade being unsheathed very, very slowly. "Where is the deed now?" he asked when she finished. "Fenwick's study. 3rd floor, east wing, behind a painting of a woman with a red scarf." She paused. "Please don't ask me how I know that." "I wasn't going to." He stood and extended his hand. "Come with me. You can't just walk into a lord's private study." "I can. Not without consequences." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't decode, something patient and fierce all at once. "Vesa, come with me." She took his hand. They moved through the manor like shadows, up a servant's staircase she'd memorized from blueprints, and he navigated as if he'd been here before. The 3rd floor was quiet. all closed doors and lamplight pooling on dark wood. Aldrich walked directly to the study without hesitation, tried the handle, and when it didn't give, pressed his palm flat against the lock. Something clicked, not mechanical, deeper, like the lock had decided on its own to obey. Vesa stared. How did you... Later. He pushed the door open and stepped aside, letting her enter first. The study smelled of pipe smoke and old paper. She found the painting immediately, the woman with the red scarf, and behind it, a small iron safe. Her heart was hammering. Her fingers shook as she worked the dial, a combination she'd bribed a former maid to reveal. The safe opened. The deed was there, yellowed and folded, her father's signature at the bottom in ink that still smelled faintly of lavender because he'd always kept dried lavender in his writing desk. Her eyes burned. I have it, she whispered. A voice from the doorway said, How touching. Dorian stood in the threshold, flanked by two of Fenwick's guards. His smile was the worst thing she'd ever seen. Theft, he said pleasantly. From a lord's private study, during his own gala. That's hanging in this province, isn't it? He tilted his head. Unless, of course, someone were to intervene on your behalf. Someone who cares about you. He let the implication hang in the air like smoke. Vesa's blood went cold. The deed crumpled in her fist. She could see the path he was laying out. The same trap he'd always used. Kindness as a cage, rescue as a leash. She doesn't need your intervention, Aldrich said from behind her. He stepped forward, and the quality of the air changed. The guards shifted, not toward him but away, an unconscious animal response to something their bodies understood before their minds did. Aldrich moved past Vesa, putting himself between her and the door, and when he looked at Dorian, all the warmth she'd seen in his eyes was gone. What replaced it was winter. Lord Ashmore, Aldrich said, and his voice was so quiet it filled the room like water fills a glass, slowly and completely. You purchased debts belonging to Vesa Thornwood's late father. You used those debts to coerce a young woman into an engagement she did not consent to. When she fled, you made no effort to return her property or release the claim. The deed she is holding belongs to her family. It was taken through manipulation, not legal sale. Dorian's smile faltered. And who exactly are you to make such accusations? Aldrich reached into his jacket and pulled out a signet ring. He didn't put it on. He just held it up, the way one holds a lantern to dispel shadow. And the firelight caught the crest carved into the heavy gold, a wolf encircling a crown. The guards dropped to one knee instantly. Dorian's face went the color of old ash. My name, Aldrich said, is Aldrich Voss, and I believe you know what that means. Vesa's legs nearly buckled. Aldrich Voss, the Alpha King, the ruler of every territory from the Blackwood Range to the Silver Coast. The man whose name was spoken in whispers, whose power was the stuff of legends and nightmares depending on which side of his mercy you stood. She had kissed the Alpha King in a garden and asked him to pretend he loved her. Your Majesty? Dorian stammered, the color draining from his face so completely he looked like a corpse someone had propped upright. I had no idea you were attending Lord Fenwick's gala. Had I known, you'd have hidden your cruelties more carefully. Aldrich finished. I know. He pocketed the ring. The debt your family holds over the Thornwood estate is dissolved as of this moment. The land deed returns to its rightful owner. And you will leave this province by morning. You can't. I can. The same two words he'd spoken to Vesa, but sharpened now, honed to a killing edge. I just did. Dorian looked at Vesa, and in his eyes she saw something she had never seen there before. Fear. Real, animal fear. He left without another word. The guards followed. The study was quiet except for the pop and hiss of the fire and the sound of Vesa trying very hard not to cry. She failed. The tears came in a rush, silent and hot, and she pressed the deed against her chest and bent forward like her body was trying to protect the last piece of her father she had left. She didn't hear Aldrich move, but she felt him. the warmth of his hand settling carefully between her shoulder blades, not pulling her close, just letting her know he was there. "Why?" she managed. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of authority, stripped of command, stripped of everything except something raw and honest that made her chest crack open. "I knew you the moment you looked up at me," he said. "I've been waiting a very long time, Vesa." She lifted her head. His face was close, and in the firelight his amber eyes held no pretense, no performance, no game. Just a vast, aching certainty. "The bond," she whispered. She'd heard the stories. Every child raised in the kingdoms had. The pull between fated mates, the recognition that lived in the blood and the bones, the thread that connected two souls across any distance. She'd always thought it was a fairy tale. "I felt it when you touched me," he said, "in the garden, before you asked me to pretend." "You weren't pretending. No, not any of it. Not a single moment." She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "I asked the Alpha King to fake being in love with me." And the Alpha King said forever. His hand moved from her back to her face, cupping her jaw, his thumb tracing the path of a tear. "I meant it, Vesa. I know this is fast. I know you have every reason not to trust anyone, especially someone with power over you. I won't ask you for anything tonight except the chance to see you again." She stared at him. This man who had walked into a lord's study like he owned it because he essentially did. This man who had kissed her like she was sacred and stood between her and her monster, like it cost him nothing. This man who was looking at her now like she was the most important thing in a kingdom he ruled. "What if I'm not what you think I am?" she asked. "What if I'm just a girl who steals things and sleeps in barns and doesn't know how to be anyone's anything?" "Then I'll build you a barn," he said simply. "And you can steal whatever you want." She laughed. A real laugh, bright and broken and surprised out of her like a bird startled from a branch. His eyes softened at the sound, and something settled in the space between them, golden and warm and humming like a plucked string finding its note. She kissed him. This time she was the one who moved first, rising onto her toes and pressing her mouth to his, with all the clumsy, desperate honesty of someone who had never let herself want anything before. He caught her like he'd been waiting for it, one arm banding around her waist, the other hand buried in her hair, and when she opened her mouth against his, the sound he made was reverent, like prayer, like gratitude, like coming home after a war he'd been fighting alone. They left Lord Fenwick's estate together that night. Aldrich's carriage was unmarked, simple, nothing to announce what he was, and when he helped her inside, his hand lingered on hers. "Where do you want to go?" he asked. "I don't have anywhere." "You have me." He paused. "If you want." She looked at the deed in her hands. The land it represented was far away, a farmstead she barely remembered, a life that had been stolen from her. She looked at Aldrich, standing in the cold night with his breath clouding between them and his amber eyes, patient and bright and waiting. "Take me home," she said, "whichever one that turns out to be." 3 months later, Vesa stood in the kitchen of the Alpha King's private residence and burned the eggs. Not dramatically. Not in a way that required intervention or alarm. Just a quiet, persistent scorching that she noticed only when Aldrich appeared in the doorway, wearing a sleep-rumpled shirt and an expression of deeply entertained affection. "You're burning the eggs," he observed. "I am aware. Would you like help?" "I would like," she said, pointing the spatula at him, "for you to stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I'm the most interesting thing you've ever seen. It's distracting. I can't cook under those conditions." He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, took the spatula from her hand and kissed her forehead. "You can't cook under any conditions," he murmured against her hair. "I love that about you." She elbowed him, He laughed and caught her around the waist, lifting her onto the counter like she weighed nothing, and she hooked her ankles behind his back and let him kiss her properly while the eggs smoked gently behind them. The 3 months since the gala had been the most disorienting and wonderful of her life. She'd expected the palace to be cold, marble and protocol, and people who looked at her bare feet and calloused hands and saw someone who didn't belong. And some of them did look at her that way, in the beginning. The advisors with their ledgers and their careful silences, the courtiers with their pressed smiles. But Aldrich had a way of ending those looks, not with commands, not with threats, simply by treating her, in every room and every conversation, as his equal. He asked her opinion on trade agreements. He introduced her to foreign dignitaries as Vesa Thornwood, the woman I intend to spend my life with, and said it with such plain conviction that arguing would have felt like arguing with weather. He brought her father's deed to the land registrar personally and watched as the Thornwood farmstead was returned to her name. "You don't have to live there," he'd said, "but it's yours. No one will take it again." She'd cried and he'd held her, and neither of them pretended it was about the land. The hardest part was letting herself trust it. Some nights she woke gasping, certain it was all a dream, certain she was still sleeping in a frozen barn with her coat pulled over her head and nothing ahead of her but another day of survival. On those nights, Aldrich didn't ask questions. He simply pulled her against his chest, his heartbeat steady under her ear, and held her until her breathing matched his. "Still here," he would say into the dark, "still yours." The bond between them had settled into something warm and constant, a golden thread she could feel even when they were in separate rooms, a quiet hum that brightened when he looked at her and sang when he touched her. She'd stopped being afraid of it, stopped waiting for it to be a trick, started letting herself lean into it the way she leaned into his arms, fully and without apology. "The eggs are ruined," she announced now, peering over his shoulder at the smoking pan. "I'll make new ones. You're a king. Kings don't make eggs." "This king does." He set her down gently. "This king makes eggs and fixes leaking roofs and reads trade reports in bed at night while his mate steals all the blankets and wouldn't trade a single moment of it." She leaned against the counter and watched him crack eggs into a clean pan with the practiced ease of someone who had not always been a king, who had spent his own years of solitude before the crown found him, who understood hunger and cold and loneliness in ways his court would never know. He'd told her those stories in the dark, his voice quiet, his fingers tracing patterns on her back. A boy raised in the mountain territories, a boy who'd fought for everything. They matched. That was what still surprised her. Not the bond, not the magic, not the kingdom or the title or the impossible luck of stumbling into a garden and finding a fated mate. What surprised her was how well they fit, his silences and her chatter, his patience and her impulsiveness, his steadiness and her sharp edges. He didn't smooth her down. He just stood close enough that her edges couldn't cut her anymore. "Aldrich? When I asked you to pretend that night?" She paused. "What would you have done if it wasn't real? If there was no bond?" He didn't hesitate. "I would have pretended. For as long as you needed. Even without the bond. Even without the bond." He looked at her, and his eyes were the same amber they'd always been, warm and wild and certain. "I didn't fall in love with you because of magic, Vesa. The magic just made sure I was standing in the right garden at the right time. Everything after that was you." She crossed the kitchen and wrapped her arms around him from behind, pressing her face between his shoulder blades where his heartbeat was strongest. He covered her hands with his, lacing their fingers together over his chest. "The eggs are burning again," she mumbled into his back. "I know." Neither of them moved. Outside, autumn sunlight poured through the kitchen windows, and somewhere in the distance, the wolves in the palace woods began to sing, low and joyful and eternal, the way they always did when their king was happy. The golden thread between them hummed its quiet, steady song, and Vesa closed her eyes and held on to the man who had been asked to pretend and had chosen, instead, to be real. Forever, he'd said. He meant it. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Where are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. I love hearing your thoughts. And if you'd like to support me, please subscribe. It's free, and it helps more people hear these stories.